Hi everyone, I'm Tim Madigan. I'm here with Dr. Patrick O'Malley, my friend and author of the new book, Getting Grief Right, Finding Your Story of Love and the Sorrow of Loss. We're going to be producing a series of these short videos that we hope will be helpful to those of you out there who are grieving, or if you're the loved one of a person grieving, that you might find some information here that will, as Patrick has said, normalize the experience. Over the years, many people have come to you after 6 months, a year, 2 years, or whatever the time period is after a loss, and they're still really hurting. And they haven't achieved closure. They haven't reached acceptance, the quote-unquote final stage. Other people are telling them in subtle or unsubtle ways that, that it's time for them to move on. How would you begin with someone like that?
Well, the what's wrong with me question is very frequently asked. And what I typically do with that is to actually encourage the person to set that question aside for just a minute. And I ask them to start to tell me about their loved one. I want to know everything I can about them. I want to hear the story of who they were, who they meant to the person who's sitting in the office, what the loss was like, what happened. And once they tell me their story, then I'm able to answer their question about what's wrong with them. Because almost always what I can say is, what's wrong with you is that you loved this person that's died. So there's nothing wrong with you. The length and the intensity of your grief is a direct relationship to your love for the one who died. And time after time after time through the years, what I have seen is the relief that people experience when they hear that. It changes their whole perspective. Because now I'm not having to be self-critical or feel shame from either what I'm saying to myself or what I'm hearing others say to me, but I'm able to connect with the fact that there's nothing wrong. I love somebody, I've lost that person through death, and what I'm feeling is a result of that love and that loss. And I was in that same spot early in my career. I had just begun practice, was in about a year when our son died, who had was born 3 months premature, and ended up spending 6 months of his life in the neonatal intensive unit, and he was home for 3 months, and we thought we were actually through the worst of it and that we were on our way in terms of him being healthy and growing, and he had an unexpected event one night and died. And I was in that actual same question about 6 months into my loss of wondering what was wrong with me. I was trained in forms of therapy that really valued the idea of resolution and closure and catharsis. And I went to therapy to try to get that to happen for myself. I participated in my own rituals to try to get that to happen. But I kept feeling, and I kept hurting, and I kept feeling sadness. And so I turned to what I knew, which were the very popular, even more so now, but a popular idea back then, which was the idea that grief went through stages, and that I must be stuck in a stage. I wasn't obviously, achieving resolution and closure, so somewhere along the way I must not have fulfilled what I needed to. And I worked at that for several years, and I worked with my clients for several years in that same model, because I was getting a lot of referrals for people who had loss because they knew that I had. And I went through that for several years, and maybe the mid-'80s is when that began to change, because I just realized how unsatisfying that was for me. And although it was occasionally of modest help to my clients, it really wasn't useful to them, because we kept this pressure on ourselves about having to reach resolution, having to reach closure, which implied we should not be feeling what we're feeling. It implied the intensity and the length of our sadness, our loss, or disappointment, or confusion should have come to some conclusion by then.
This guy we write about in the book, this guy named Scott, this construction worker who came to see you, seemed to be kind of a turning point in how you viewed this. Could you talk about Scott a little bit?
I tell the story of Scott because he was one that stands out to me in this period of time. I was really starting to question whether or not the stages were useful. And Scott was a burly, construction guy that owned a company with his dad, and he was reluctant to come. He was not the kind of guy that normally seek out therapy, but his wife and his pastor had encouraged him to do it. By his own admission, he'd been drinking a bit too much, and they were just worried about him. I asked him about that, and he agreed. And he said, his dad would just shudder to think that he was sitting in a therapist's office, but he was going to fulfill his obligation because he told them they would come. And so I, at that point, was still using this model of the stages, and so I'd try and figure out where people were stuck, like I thought I was stuck. And I thought this will be great because Scott's a construction worker, and this is a pretty linear model. This ought to go well. So I introduced the idea of the stages and said, I think what our work needs to be is to figure out where you may be stuck in these stages. And he basically said, that sounds like a bunch of hooey to me. And he just launched into a story about his dad and told me about his history with his dad and some times when he was a kid and he got into trouble and how his dad responded to him, and talked about how his dad was had such integrity at work and how he managed customers, and they would often get into fights over that because this fellow Scott thought that his dad was way too generous with problems that customers would have. And then at the end of the first hour, I said, well, coming close to time to end, and he looked disappointed. He had more stories to tell. And I said, you're here at the request of other folks. It's up to you if you want to come back. He says, I'll give it another shot. So he came back and he did the same thing. And I kept trying to interrupt him to get to the work. We thought of it as grief work, and he wasn't working. He was telling me stories. And so I finally gave up. He wasn't going to bite on this idea that there was some way it ought to happen. And so he told the story, and he finally got to the part of being able to talk about his dad's death, that he'd had a massive heart attack and what it was like in the emergency room. And there he connected with his pain and was able to just deeply connect with what was going on with him. This kind of tough fella, construction guy, opened up and began to weep that he knew more what he needed than I did. He needed to tell this story and have a place for it to be received. And it occurred to me at that point that all my ideas of intervention and trying to march him through a certain model of grief was really not useful at all. That his therapy was his story. He needed to tell his story. And I was starting to notice that with other people at the same time, and that's where I really started to make this transition out of what we think of as this prescriptive model about how people ought to grieve, to being able to connect them deeply with their story. That this wasn't about some arbitrary work to be done around grief as much as it was to tap into the story. Whatever that story was, complex, simple, traumatic, but to connect people back to their story. That's really was their therapy, was to be able to do that and have a safe place for that story to be received. So it's at that point I really started to transition out of how I had dealt with clients and myself through the several years after my son had died, and really opened up to just doing a very committed listening and helping encourage the story.
How does a person connecting with their story kind of change the nature of grieving, or change the equation when it comes to grieving?
Well, in the next few years, and really up until I would say even somebody came in last week, people started coming in more self-diagnosed. The stages of grief were getting very embedded into the culture and even into pop culture. And so I would have more and more folks in the late 80s and all the way through the 90s up till now come in self-analyzing that something was wrong with them. So the first thing that would happen is I'd try to connect with them with their story was that they could drop the self-criticism. They could quit analyzing their grief and embrace their story. And so it changed several things. One was it dropped the self-criticism. One was it gave them some confidence that they were not doing it wrong. And I've had actually many people through the years end up defending themselves, if that makes sense, better to people who are critical of them, because they were able to say, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm grieving because I'm sad. I miss my loved one. I love that person, and this is healthy, and there's nothing wrong, and there's no shame in it. So I saw a change in their level of shame about it, a change in their self-criticism, and really a freeing, if you will. That doesn't mean they got the feeling better, if you want to use that language, but they were able to more deeply feel and understand what those feelings meant. And so I think it changed, folks in several different ways. And it also, I think, encouraged them to not put themselves on some sort of arbitrary deadline. They were able now to look at this as part of their long life story. And they were able to tell their story to others. Now that becomes a problem because oftentimes there's not others to hear the story. And that's something we can talk about at some point. How can we be a better community? But it would get people into support groups. It would get people to find somebody that they could tell their story to. And they also became much better listeners to others. Everybody who's gone through this that I've talked to, it changes their perspective. So they become a better friend and family member to others who have suffered loss.
Thanks everyone for watching. We hope you found this helpful. And stay tuned. We'll have another short video like this in the next week or so. And take care, everyone. We'll see you next time.